once was a little man called Niggle, who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go. Indeed, the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry with his preparations. Hi, welcome back to the library, and we're returning this month to JRR Tolkien and his marvelous short story, Leaf by Niggle. And what I just read was the charming first lines. And a reader going into it, that opening line, he had a long journey to make. You don't know what that journey means until you start reading it, and eventually that journey is not just life, but more importantly, death, and the afterlife that comes beyond. But what makes this story so interesting is, one, it is not of Middle-earth, but in some ways, it's also about Middle-earth. Tolkien did not write a bunch of short stories in his life, very few. But this one, he wrote while, in a point in writing Lord of the Rings, was struggling. The New Hobbit, as it was originally called, kept growing and growing, and not just growing, but it became a deeper and deeper entwined with the legendarium that he had been working on his entire life. And the struggles of a writer, particularly of one who seems to never create one thing, but creates always one thing that's a part of a greater, always growing whole, is what Tolkien is talking about in Leaf by Niggle. Now, Leaf by Niggle is about a man named Niggle. And the name itself means someone who's always like picking at the edge of the thing, always working, picking at the work. And he's a painter, so Tolkien at least gives himself that little bit of space between him and his character. Niggle is a painter rather than a writer. But Niggle, whose specialty is painting leaves, has the ambition to paint a whole tree. But as he works at each little detail on the tree, other things start to come in. And when he decides to work on other things, well, he realizes they're just a part of the tree as well. The background, mountains in the distance, birds flying in the sky and then nestling in the trees. Everything he does seems to be intertwined with this one great project of his. But as the opening line says, eventually death will come, and he's not really making preparations. And so what he's doing, however, is living life. He has to help his neighbor, Mr. Parrish, who's always in need of help, whether he's sick or needs help with his roof. And Niggle, even though he may complain, is always willing to help. But then, of course, the journey comes. His carriage on the pathway to death arrives, and the painting's not done. But he is shepherded off into a sort of purgatory, and ultimately is allowed to arrive at a tree. But not any tree, his tree. Tolkien was a big believer in an idea that he called subcreation. Now, unlike Lewis or Barfield or Williams, Tolkien did not devote a lot of time to overt theology. He let his ideas about faith express themselves more subtly in fiction. But in this story, he's illustrating just how important it is to be an artist, and how that act of what he called subcreation, of allowing your imagination to build out these fully formed ideas, is actually a sacred act. So much so that in his afterlife, this tree by Niggle is given full form. And it's not just the tree he painted, it's the tree he imagined. Now, at the end, Niggle is reunited with his neighbor, They tend to the garden and house that are around this tree until finally they're called to go on over the mountains to heaven. And it's from beginning to end a beautiful expression of life, of being an artist, of being imaginative, of being a creator, or as Tolkien would say, a sub-creator. And this book, or books, this short story, is from beginning to end an expression of this deeply held idea. And one day we will do the essay that is often paired with it on fairy stories, which is the closest Tolkien really wrote about any kind of overt theological idea. And so one day we'll pay attention to that essay specifically. But here in this story, he let that idea not just play out in himself, but play out for all of us to see. So what are the strengths of this story? Well, one, Tolkien, who was always a brilliant writer, like The Hobbit, is very... there's a certain playfulness with the language, a certain, purity of emotion in this language. And since it's so clearly about himself, for anyone who knows just a little bit about Tolkien's life, about Tolkien, how Tolkien wrote, it's so clearly biographical in not the events of the story, but the emotions of the story, that it always feels true, even with the, going on into the afterlife, which of course we know have no experience with because we are still living. But even into that part of it, it feels true from beginning to end. And so his use of language there is so important. And Tolkien famously hated allegory. And this story seems very allegorical. I think he would probably argue, though, that because we don't have to be JRR Tolkien, and we don't have to know JRR Tolkien's life to be able to get something out of this story. I think he would say that it avoided allegory, but certainly it can be read very allegorically. But but also because he did allow it to become as close to allegory as he ever allowed any work to be. In some sense, he wrote with such a specific message because of that. And I think that makes the story stronger. Whereas, of course, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and other works of his have messages, but there's so many, and so many are unintended. This one is it has an argument to make, and I think it makes the argument well. So what are the weaknesses of Leaf by Niggle? This is, for me, like reading The Hobbit. I'm pretty hard-pressed to say what is the weakness. Even though he's talking about the afterlife, Tolkien's not doing anything overtly Christian with his imagery or his language about the afterlife. Perhaps, as someone who's a writer, this is me maybe trying to imagine coming at this story as someone who's not an artist, not particularly, not someone who exercises their imaginative muscles. That experience may not ring true, may not ring as deeply if you aren't a writer or artist or some kind of imaginative soul in some way, shape, or form. That would be the only weakness I could come up with. I think this is, in this little short story, he brought his full craft to it and shaped it, I think, just about perfectly. So how do we rank the story? Well, if I'm struggling that hard to come up with weakness, I'm going to be ranking it 5 out of 5. And, I mean, Tolkien is my favorite writer, but story is just really... There are very few stories like this to me in literature in general. But Tolkien's defense of being an artist is really important to me, and I think even if you're not an artist, is going to come through great. So again, yeah, 5 out of 5 stars. Thanks for coming on the channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I did forget to say that at the top of the video, but don't forget to like and subscribe because we've got new content coming at you every Sunday. Next month here on the Inkling Review, we're going to be returning to Owen Barfield, and we're going to be tackling his first novel, the first fantasy novel published by the Inkling group, The Silver Trumpet. So join us next month as we tackle that book from Barfield. And of course, again, don't forget to join us every week. And in the meantime, y'all have a great day, and I'll see you soon.